If you spend any time on political YouTube, you've likely come across countless lazy, oversimplified videos portraying the Chinese government as an oppressive regime that brutally censors the internet to keep its population in the dark. Western media constantly pushes the narrative that Chinese internet restrictions are inherently bad, claiming that Chinese people live in an information bubble, have no knowledge of the outside world, and lack the ability to voice concerns. They're all wrong. These criticisms don't come from a place of genuine concern for the Chinese people. Instead, they stem from a deeply ingrained sense of Western superiority. The idea that the free Western internet is the golden standard and that Western democracy is the only legitimate form of governance. However, with every passing day, this claim becomes more impossible to defend. The illusion of free speech in the West is rapidly crumbling as social media platforms are openly manipulated by their billionaire owners and as Western governments increasingly suppress dissenting voices, especially when it comes to correctly critiquing them for supporting a genocide. All the way to the extent that you will lose your job, diploma, or even be deported for being mean to a country the US really likes. The reality is that China's internet firewall exists for a reason. Not about controlling the people with some devious repressive intentions in mind, but about protecting social stability, national security, and economic independence. In today's video, we're going to debunk the two biggest misconceptions about China's internet firewall. The first being, the firewall limits Chinese citizens' access to the outside world, keeps them heavily propagandized, and prevents them from understanding other political and economic systems. And number two, that Chinese people have no ability to voice concerns, critique the government, or push for change. Not only will I explain why both of these claims are completely false, but I'll also break down three major benefits of keeping the US-dominated internet infrastructure out of China without restrictions. The West serves as a real-time case study of what an unfiltered anything-goes digital environment can lead to: mass polarization, disinformation, social fragmentation, and widespread mental health issues. To fully grasp why China is cautious about unregulated foreign influence, we need to look at its historical context. China's modern resurgence follows a century of national humiliation that lasted from 1839 to 1949. This period was marked by foreign invasions, land seizures, and economic exploitation at the hands of Western powers in Japan. One of the most devastating periods was the Opium Wars, where British waged war against China to force the population into drug addiction. When China resisted, it was brutally defeated and forced into a series of unequal treaties, ceding control over key territories like Hong Kong and granting Western powers near total economic dominance over the Chinese ports. European powers, along with the US and Japan, carved out spheres of influence within China, controlling trade and resources while the Chinese people suffered. This pattern of foreign exploitation continued well into the 20th century. China was brutally invaded by the Japanese in the 1930s, suffering atrocities like the Nanjing Massacre, where hundreds of thousands were killed. It wasn't until 1949 that China regained sovereignty under its own terms. When viewed through this historical lens, it becomes clear why China is deeply protective of its political and economic independence. Unlike Western nations that have long enjoyed global dominance, China's recent history is one of fighting to reclaim its sovereignty from foreign control. So when Western governments and corporations push for unrestricted influence within China, it is not surprising that the Chinese government and people alike view such efforts with deep skepticism. They've seen firsthand of how unchecked foreign influence can destabilize a nation, and they have no intention of letting history repeat itself. Also, you might be surprised to know that it wasn't China who kicked out American big tech corporations like Meta and Google. American companies voluntarily left the market when they wouldn't follow Chinese terms of service. Meanwhile, other major Western companies like Apple, Microsoft, and Tesla have continued to operate in China by adapting to local regulations. This highlights a key difference in how tech restrictions are often portrayed. While the US has actively banned or restricted Chinese firms like Huawei or TikTok on national security grounds, China's approach has largely been regulatory, leaving companies with a choice to comply or exit. It is entirely understandable why the Chinese government imposes strict regulations on foreign tech companies operating within its borders. Western governments and intelligence agencies have repeatedly used these platforms to influence political movements, destabilize governments, and push for regime change in countries that refuse to align with their interests. This isn't speculation. It's a well-documented strategy that has been carried out numerous times, from Ukraine and Georgia to Romania, many Latin American nations, and beyond.
One doesn't have to be brilliant to attempt a coup.
I disagree with that as somebody who has helped plan coup d'etat.
In fact, Western officials and organizations openly discuss and allocate substantial funding towards these goals, framing them as democracy promotion or support for civil society.
First, we thought that getting Guaido to declare himself president would be enough to topple the regime. Then we thought putting aid on the border would be enough. Then we tried to sort of construct a kind of coup in April of last year, and it blew up in our face when all the generals that were supposed to break with Maduro decided to stick with him in the end. We undermined Norway's talks last summer, and then this March we released a transition framework that frankly is almost a carbon copy of the very one that was in front of the parties last year.
When it comes to China, they're not even subtle about their intentions. Think tanks, government agencies, and media outlets frequently call for strategies to weaken or alter the Chinese political system. Given this context, it's hardly surprising that China enforces strict digital sovereignty policies, ensuring that foreign tech companies operating within its borders cannot be used as tools for external political interference. Just last year, the House passed $1.6 billion to deliver anti-China propaganda overseas. Knowing all this, how can you look at that and be like, yep, better let all that shit in without any restrictions? You really can't blame the government for looking out for its own national interests. If there was a similar authenticated legitimate threat to the US government, you can damn well expect they would crack down on it too. Now that we've established the firewall, what it does, and its context, let's debunk the common misconceptions around it. Starting with the first one, that the firewall limits Chinese citizens' access to the outside world, keeps them heavily propagandized, and prevents them from understanding other political and economic systems. Western critics love to claim that the people of China don't have access to the internet, that they're completely cut off from platforms like TikTok and YouTube. The way they describe it, you'd think that the Chinese are living in the Stone Age. This is complete nonsense. China has built their own internet ecosystem that mirrors every function of the Western internet. They have their own versions of Google, YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, and every other major platform you can think of. These apps offer nearly identical experiences. On China's version of TikTok, you'll find the same mix of trends, gaming content, food vlogs, and cringe dance videos. Their version of YouTube, Bilibili, hosts everything from nature documentaries, in-depth political analysis, food bloggers, and travel vlogs. What's especially interesting is the political content. A lot of Westerners might assume that Chinese platforms are filled with anti-American rhetoric, but that's not the case. In fact, political content is relatively balanced, and if anything, there's even a slightly positive view of America. The harshest takes you'll find tend to be lighthearted or comedic, poking fun at the absurdity of certain American politicians. Surprisingly, Trump is actually quite popular, with Chinese users often finding him funny or entertaining. You'll see edits of him at speeches and clips where he's treated more like a meme than a villain.
Okay, absolutely. Melania said this was okay.
I just got a nice coast on here.
China, 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 China. Let's say China, 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 China. Now, you know.
While Donald Trump was building a reality TV show, my brother was building a security apparatus to keep us safe. And I'm proud of what he did.
The World Trade Center came down
He had the gall to go after
Joe Biden became mentally impaired. Kamala was born that way. You know what I do with him? Thank you very much, John. Thank you very much. You will never make it. Go ahead.
Meanwhile, on Western platforms, it's become a whole genre to predict China's imminent collapse, with video after video pushing the same doomsday narratives. You won't find hundreds of "why America will collapse" videos on Chinese social media, even though there are plenty of valid criticisms that could be made. Political discussions are less aggressive, and when they do happen, they tend to be more good faith discussions rather than fear-mongering or propaganda. This just goes to show how much Western media relies on people's lack of knowledge about the country to paint China as the enemy. The sincerity with which Chinese people engage in diplomacy and discuss global affairs on their platforms feels like someone extending a handshake only to get a punch in the face in return. The whole idea that Chinese people are cut off from the modern world is laughable, and if anything, it's Westerners who are in the dark about what life in China is really like. The brief TikTok ban showed this perfectly, as some Americans who migrated to Chinese platforms discovered that life in China is modern, affordable, and that locals are generally warm and welcoming to foreigners. If you don't believe me, go check out Xiaohongshu, or Red Note as it's called in English, or Bilibili to see for yourself what Chinese social media is actually like. You might be surprised at what you might find.
I really think America has made a huge mistake when banning this app, because now that we're all on Red Note, we're actually learning that a lot of the crap that they've been talking about China is absolutely not true. We're like, wait a second, you guys have universal healthcare? You don't have to pay for an ambulance when you get picked up to the hospital. You have amazing cars for very low prices. Huawei, the amazing phones they have, are also so much better than iPhones. And all of that is forbidden here. We cannot have any of that. Wait a second, you can walk at night outside and not be afraid? There's no mass unalivings in schools? What? What's that like? And I had someone comment on my Red Note being like, now that you're here, I hope you can see that we're not the beasts that, your news made us seem to be. And I was like, we never thought you guys were. I feel like we always knew it was bullshit. And yeah, no country's perfect. There's a lot of issues everywhere in this world. But It's very interesting. We're learning much more, I think, than they wanted us to know.
And yet here we are learning about how affordable their cost of living is. How 90% of people in China own the place that they live in. How they don't really have homeless people. They don't have a drug problem. Like, their groceries are affordable. They only have to work one job in order to pay their bills. They were confused about having to pay for an ambulance ride. They literally have universal health care. Our government decided that in order to get us to not want communism, they had to make it seem like it was this big, scary, crazy thing, and to basically shield us from it. And look, we're literally talking to people that live under that type of government, and they're happy. They're happy, and they cannot believe how Americans are letting America run. And they feel sorry for us. That's sad.
Chinese people are also some of the most well-traveled in the world. In 2023 alone, mainland Chinese citizens made 206 million international trips. To put that into perspective, the entire population of the United States is about 345 million. And yet, despite experiencing the world firsthand, all 206 million of those Chinese travelers chose to come home. Not because they were forced to, but because the quality of life in China is high. Beyond tourism, China has one of the largest groups of international students in the world. Every year, hundreds of thousands of Chinese students enroll in Western universities, gaining access to a vast range of academic perspectives, many of which are openly critical of China. Yet after spending years immersed in these environments, 90% of them return home. Tens of millions of Chinese citizens have studied abroad or are currently pursuing degrees in the West. The idea that they are simply brainwashed or lack knowledge to the outside world, especially when compared to Americans, is completely unfounded. In fact, I would confidently argue that the average Chinese citizen, particularly young people, have a far more accurate understanding of global affairs than an average American. China's education system, despite its intensity, is one of the best in the world. In my personal conversations with Chinese people, I found that they often have a stronger grasp of current geopolitics, world history, and even American history than many Americans themselves. Check out interviews on the channel Asian Boss and see how informed they are. Chinese students are taught about key moments in US history from the Revolutionary War to the Civil Rights Movement and generally have a nuanced understanding of how different political systems function. Ironically, while Americans tend to see communism through the lens of decades of Cold War era propaganda, Chinese people actually approach the topic with a more balanced, pragmatic perspective. They don't just blindly claim that communism is superior, nor do they try to impose their ideology on others. Instead, it's often Westerners who feel the need to aggressively defend capitalism and impose their worldview on Chinese people. The reality is that Chinese people simply believe that their system works for their country, while Americans, despite being typically less informed, tend to be far more defensive about their own system. That being said, Chinese people are generally far less political than Americans. This isn't just unique to China, it's a broader trend across East Asia and Japan and Korea as well, compared to the US, where people across the political spectrum, young and old, are deeply ingrained in political debates. The average Chinese citizen simply doesn't think about politics on a daily basis. Instead, their focus is on education, work, family, and enjoying life. And in many ways, this is one of the strongest endorsements of China's political system, the fact that it doesn't need to dominate people's lives. Government only becomes a major concern when it is actively failing, when policies are harming people's livelihoods, when institutions are ineffective, or when systematic issues create widespread frustration. In China, the fact that most people don't feel the need to engage in constant political discourse is in itself evidence of a functional and effective system. They don't have to fight for basic necessities or worry about whether their government will provide stability, it simply does. As a result, there's a baseline level of trust that allows people to focus on their personal ambitions rather than constantly questioning whether their government is working for them. Contrast that with the United States, where politics is inescapable because so many people feel personally impacted. Whether through stagnant wages, unaffordable healthcare, rising cost of living, or a political system that often seems more focused on culture wars than solving real problems. Do you really think Americans would be this obsessed with elections or hyperfixated on every new political controversy if they actually trusted their government to function properly? Of course not. The intensity of political engagement in the US isn't a sign of a healthy democracy. It's a symptom of a system that repeatedly fails its people. Meanwhile, in China, the vast majority of people, politics is simply not a priority because it doesn't have to be. Okay, so Chinese people have their own internet ecosystem, they're highly educated, and they travel the world. But what about censorship? When it comes to censorship, Chinese people are very aware of what they can and can't post online. The government is very clear about what's off limits: sedition against the government, racism, pornography, and all the other things mentioned in the beginning. It's straightforward, and the rules are well known. The difference is that in China, censorship is explicit and people understand it as part of the broader structure. In the West, however, censorship is often arbitrary and used to reinforce the dominant narratives pushed by powerful elites. Over the past few years, we've witnessed the unraveling of Western ideals of free speech and a free internet. The most recent example of this have been the systematic suppression of pro-Palestinian content, as well as cover-ups of war crimes in Gaza. For years, Western media outlets like the New York Times and platforms like Meta have controlled the narrative by limiting access to certain information and shaping public perception. But one platform that couldn't be fully controlled was TikTok, which allowed an entirely new generation to get access to information about the genocide in Gaza. This became a massive ongoing battle to ban or censor the content that was circulating on the app. In the US, the media landscape is becoming more and more consolidated, with powerful players like Jeff Bezos using outlets like the Washington Post to promote narratives that serve their own interests. Recently, Bezos issued a directive to the Post requiring coverage that promotes personal liberties and free markets, essentially signaling that the narrative is being carefully curated to maintain the status quo of the American oligarchy. Then there's Twitter, which brands itself as the #1 free speech site, yet is anything but free speech. Like all American social media platforms, Twitter is entirely at the mercy of its billionaire owners. Elon Musk, for instance, has been known to boost far-right accounts, support political parties like the AfD in Germany, and ban or unverify users who disagree with him. Rather than a platform that fosters open dialogue, Twitter has become a toxic cesspool where far-right extremists thrive, promoting everything from race science to conspiracy theories, as long as it serves Musk's personal agenda. Although Chinese censorship is real and targeted, if anything, Western censorship is more insidious, operating under the guise of free speech while serving corporate interests. China's censorship is public and predictable, and for the vast majority of Chinese internet users and instances, censorship is irrelevant to their online experience. Now let's get to the major key that underlines this entire conversation. You can always get a VPN. A VPN allows you to access the internet in China just as you would anywhere in the world. Which brings us to today's sponsor. No, I'm fucking with you, there's no sponsor. But there is a Patreon as per request, so if you want to check that out, go ahead, thank you. But in all seriousness, if you're in China and you want to look at the Western internet, the barriers to do so are not large at all. I like this system a lot because many people won't learn about and then install a VPN until college when they are much more mature and able to approach the Western internet in a much better way. The default internet is so much better as a general internet for society. Even if you have no problem with pornography or violence being so accessible, I think we can all agree that it's not good for people at such young ages to be accessing that type of content. I know that I certainly would have benefited from not seeing pornography and executions from literally the age of 7 years old. The VPN is always accessible for those who want to use the Western internet, but I think it's great that the default internet is the way that it is. Now for the question I know you've all been thinking, what about Tiananmen Square? The event itself is a topic that deserves its own video, which will come, but let's address it briefly since I know it's likely on your mind. Despite this event being censored on the Chinese internet, many Chinese people, especially older generations, are still aware of what happened. But let's take a step back and look at how Tiananmen Square is used in the narrative against China today. If you look at the comment section of any video that talks positively about China, chances are one of the top comments will be, "What about Tiananmen Square?" As if they've just delivered the ultimate big brain original take. Although it was a tragedy, let's be real. This single event, which took place nearly 40 years ago, is used to discredit every Chinese achievement, bolster the narrative of Western superiority, and dismiss the entirety of China as a whole. The West has expertly leveraged this single tragedy by China to deflect from their own historical and ongoing atrocities. Now, what's fascinating to me is that applying the same standards of violence to discredit a government, the West's record is unimaginably worse. Since its establishment in 1949, China, with the exception of Tiananmen Square and one border skirmish with Vietnam, has risen overwhelmingly peacefully. Even if we take the largest Western estimates of Tiananmen Square and say that thousands upon thousands died, this is still a drop of water compared to the ocean of death caused by Western intervention around the world. Not even considering the horrors of colonization and slavery, millions of people have died in Western-led wars in the modern era. The Iraq War, the Afghanistan conflict, the Vietnam War alone accounted for millions of deaths. The total death toll of these conflicts is staggering, with estimates around 1 million people dying in Iraq alone, over 170,000 in Afghanistan, and 2 to 3 million in Vietnam. And those are just the wars Americans generally know about. How many know that during the Korean War, the US dropped more bombs and napalm on Korea than were used in the entire Pacific theater of World War II? In fact, 75% of North Korean towns and cities were destroyed by US bombings, killing 2 to 3 million, with 70% of the deaths being civilians. How many young Americans are aware of the My Lai massacre, where 504 civilians, mostly women and children, were sexually assaulted and murdered by US Army soldiers? I just recently traveled to Laos. How many people know that American bombers dropped bombs on Laos for nearly a decade from 1964 to 1973, all the while keeping it completely secret from its own people? America dropped a plane full of bombs on the country every 8 minutes, 24 hours a day, for 9 years. During this campaign on Laos, which is only an area the size of Oregon, Villages of innocent villagers who had no involvement in the Vietnam War lived in misery for a decade. Bombers were simply ordered to go out and bomb without even having targets. As a result, Laos is the most bombed country per capita in history. Over 200 million unexploded bombs still litter the land, causing injuries and deaths to this day. This isn't just abroad too. How many Americans today know that the US dropped a bomb on a black neighborhood in Philadelphia, killing 11 people, 5 of whom children? Or the Kent State massacre of student protesters protesting the Vietnam War. This information is technically available, but how many Americans know about this or even care? How many even know what Laos is? Your average young Chinese person might not know about the hundreds of lives lost at Tiananmen Square in 1989. Your average American knows about a fraction of the millions of lives ended by his or her government, which has continued far past 1989 to the present day as I'm speaking these words. You tell me which is worse. And it's not just the US. Look at Japan's actions in World War II. They murdered up to 20 million Chinese civilians during the invasion of China. Yet we have very little historical remembrance of their crimes, especially compared to Nazi Germany, even when they killed millions more people. The Japanese government actively hides these atrocities from their citizens and still honors the soldiers responsible. This fact gets zero attention in the media because Japan remains subservient to the US. Ask yourselves, why don't you see destruction of Nanking as the top comment under the next travel video you see about Japan? Their youth are woefully unaware of this fact, and it's orders of magnitude worse than Tiananmen Square. This isn't simple whataboutism. Unlike the countless Western atrocities, Tiananmen Square is used to discredit every single Chinese achievement and label the entire country with the same brush. We judge China by its worst mistake and America by its latest. You could use the same logic in commenting Hiroshima and Nagasaki under any positive video of America. We hold utopian standards for China simply because it has a different economic system. The relatively much fewer mistakes that they have made in the past is used to discredit its governance system, never the other way around. Now let's debunk misconception number 2, that Chinese people have no ability to voice concerns, critique the government, or push for change. A major critique of China's firewall is that it removes the right to criticize the government. In the US, freedom of speech is a core belief. People can say whatever they want about their leaders. But does this actually lead to change, or are people just screaming into the void? If you're complaining about the government online, the assumption is that you want those issues addressed. Otherwise, you're just venting into empty space. And in the US, that's exactly what happens. Professors Martin Gillens from Princeton University and Benjamin Page from Northwestern University analyzed over 20 years of data on federal policy decisions to answer a simple question: does the US government represent its people? The answer was a resounding no. Their research showed that affluent Americans, corporations, and special interest groups have far more influence over policy than ordinary citizens. Even when 70% of Americans support a policy change, it only has about a 40% chance of being implemented. In short, the US functions much more like an oligarchy, not a democracy. In the US, you can post all day about government failures, crumbling infrastructure, unaffordable healthcare, stagnant wages, endless wars, but none of it will make a difference. You are yelling into the void.
Let's go, folks. Press button, back. Let's go.
Extremely popular positions at the nationwide level, like ending the genocide in Gaza and a universal healthcare system, aren't even mainstream political discourse, despite massive demonstrations across every city. That's how far removed the government is from the needs of the people. In the UK, people have been jailed and had their homes raided simply for discussing protests over Zoom. In the US, demonstrations are met with violent crackdowns, and protesters risk losing their jobs or even their education for opposing government policies. Germany has outright banned certain forms of protest altogether. So while Westerners pride themselves on freedom of speech, the reality is that speech without power is meaningless. It would be one thing if my argument was simply that neither America nor Chinese public sentiment affects policy, making it a wash. But that's not the case. Chinese governance is far more responsive to public needs than its Western counterparts.
What many Chinese have problem with Western media is the stereotypes about China. If you are content with stereotypes, you miss so many things. If BBC broadcasts something, they are happy to always mention this communist dictatorship, this autocracy. No, actually, with this kind of label, you cannot understand this China as it is. But if you watch BBC or CNN or read Economist and try to understand China, it will be a failure. It's impossible.
Multiple parties fight for political power and everyone voting on them as the only path to salvation to the long-suffering.
This is Eric Lee, a Shanghai entrepreneur, educated in America, and typical of a new, confident, outspoken political class.
At the moment, the Chinese, the party state, has proven an extraordinary ability to change. I mean, I make the joke, in America, you can change political parties, but you can't change policies. In China, you cannot change the party, but you can change policies. So in the 65 or 66 years, China is being run by one single party, yet the political changes that have taken place in China in this past 66 years have been wider and broader and greater than probably any other major country in modern memory.
So in that time, China ceased to be communist. Is that what you're saying?
Well, China is a market economy, and it's a vibrant market economy, but it is not a capitalist country. Here's why. There's no way a group of billionaires could control the Politburo, as billionaires control American policymaking. So in China, you have a vibrant market economy, but capital does not rise above political authority. Capital does not have enshrined rights. In America, capital, the interest of capital and capital itself has risen above the American nation. The political authority cannot check the power of capital. And that's why America is a capitalist country, but China is not.
In China, you can't change the party, but the policies change all the time. The Chinese government is highly flexible and constantly adapts to public demands. According to Western research, trust and support for the Chinese government consistently hovers around 90%, an unheard of figure compared to most Western governments, which would be happy to get 40% approval ratings. You don't need a study to confirm this. If you're in the West, go outside and ask people how they feel about their government. Meanwhile, in China, the overwhelming majority support their government. This isn't due to repression. It's because people see tangible improvements in their lives. Why wouldn't they? Over the past few decades, life in China has consistently gotten better. Essential costs like water, electricity, and phone bills are highly affordable. Housing is primarily for living, not speculative investment. Universal healthcare is guaranteed. Public transportation is extensive, efficient, and cheap. The fundamentals of daily life, things that people in the West constantly struggle with, are treated as human rights, not profit opportunities. Where Americans scream into the void with no results, the Chinese government actively seeks opinion and implements changes based on real concerns. The government conducts extensive polling across provinces to identify key issues, and a rigorous civil service system ensures that only the most capable officials are promoted. Performance matters. If an official fails to deliver on poverty alleviation or local governance, they are replaced. Unlike the West, where politicians fail upward, China's system enforces genuine accountability. Democratic participation in China exists in various forms, particularly at the local level. A prime example is the 12345 hotline, a 24/7 national complaint system where citizens can report concerns on everything from potholes to wage disputes. Every year, the system processes hundreds of millions of calls. It has a 96% resolution rate. The system ensures that problems are addressed swiftly, something unimaginable in most Western cities. In addition to elections at the local level, it's also common for local officials to give out their personal WeChat or phone numbers, allowing direct communication between citizens and government representatives. All of this results in a system that in practice is far more susceptible to the will of the majority than the illusion of democracy in the West. It's simply a different model of governance, one that prioritizes accountability and tangible results over empty rhetoric. Short of openly calling to overthrow the government, Chinese citizens have extensive, effective channels for addressing issues in their daily lives, arguably more so than in the West. Now that we've dispelled the misconceptions of the firewall, let's look at the firewall's advantages. Before we get into the advantages, please take a second to like and subscribe to the channel. Now let's get back to it. The first of the advantages of China's internet firewall is the lack of violence, hyper-accessible pornography, toxicity, and division that plague Western social media. The current state of the internet in the West reflects a deeply unhealthy society. Take X, often described as the West's real-time information hub, or the internet's town square. It has devolved into a breeding ground for far-right radicalization, misinformation, and outrage bait. Everyone's experience may vary, but for me, scrolling through X means seeing dead children and dead bodies from a Western bombing, a politician defending that bombing, pornography, a right-wing meme promoting race science, a viral video of students attacking a teacher in an American school, more porn, Elon Musk posting about some absurd right-wing take, and then an ad for Trump merchandise. Algorithms differ, but the common thread is rage, division, and nihilism. Every swipe brings a new reason to be angry, disgusted, or hopeless. Western social media is toxic. It actively fosters division along gender, racial, religious, and generational lines. The endless stream of violence, gambling, and disinformation is a symptom of a dysfunctional society. Now imagine trying to explain to a Chinese person that they're missing out on this. The second major advantage of China's internet firewall is the lack of disinformation poisoning society. In America, the sheer number of people disconnected from reality who are lost to conspiracy theories and ideological brain rot is staggering. It's honestly really depressing. It feels like every time I take an Uber or talk to someone above the age of 55, there's about a 50% chance that they'll start ranting about some ancient secret societies controlling the government or some other bizarre conspiracy.
Kobe Bryant was assassinated by the Clintons.
Which is why did the framework created by QAnon and Trump propaganda cause an innumerable amount of people to jump headfirst down the rabbit hole, endangering their safety, lives, and freedom.
We will not accept socialism as our economic and political system. Communism is communism. We will not accept communism. Australia has returned to becoming a prison island all over again. It's now a new penal colony as a prison.
There was no racism in the United States. There was no racism. There was none.
You are not going to take away our trophy bear. We will never let our country go to the globalists. George Soros, you can go to hell.
Jesus is the king of this.
He's our king, and Trump is our president. Yes, ma'am.
Disinformation is widespread, and the internet in the West is designed to pit people against each other, with algorithms that amplify negativity and outrage. Society is fractured, and large segments of the population no longer live in a shared reality. Now compare this with Chinese social media, it's a completely different world. The content is overwhelmingly positive, and you simply don't see the unhinged conspiracy cults gaining traction. Why is this? Because the poor material conditions and lack of education that breed such radicalization don't exist nearly as much in China. In the West, people's lives are deteriorating, both materially and spiritually, so they turn to fantasy explanations for their suffering. They're told capitalism isn't the problem, so they invent magical scapegoats. In China, the basic needs are met, public services function, and the education system actually works. As a result, the psychological conditions that fuel mass delusion are virtually non-existent. Now let's get to the third benefit, the economic and strategic necessity of the firewall. Beyond public discourse, one of the most important benefits of China's internet firewall is the massive economic advantage it provides. Even if you have disagreed with everything I've said so far, the economic aspect alone is reason enough to have this firewall. Platforms like Google, Amazon, Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter are not just social media or search engines, they are critical infrastructure in the modern world. They dominate commerce, data collection, and digital services, siphoning productivity, revenue, talent, and sovereignty from every country that depends on them. For nations in Europe, Latin America, and Africa, the absence of domestic equivalents to these platforms has led to stagnation or non-existent tech sectors. The US controls these digital monopolies, meaning that the revenue generated in these foreign markets is funneled back to America instead of being reinvested locally. The impact of this cannot be overstated. These platforms act like digital tax collectors, skimming off a percentage of every transaction, collecting data on every user and ensuring that major technological developments benefits America first. Take Europe as an example. Outside of Spotify, the continent has no global tech giants that can compete with the US or China. If Europe had its own Amazon, Google, and Uber, companies tailored to serve the European market, there would be stronger innovation hubs, higher wages, and a greater ability to retain talent rather than losing them to Silicon Valley. Instead, European nations have become dependent on US corporations, which cripples their technological and economic sovereignty. China recognized this early on and refused to become another American digital colony. By restricting US platforms, China ensured that domestic alternatives like Baidu, WeChat, Alibaba, and Douyin could thrive, keeping billions of dollars in profits inside China rather than handing them to US corporations. This decision allowed China to build a thriving tech sector, with major innovation hubs like Shenzhen and Hangzhou, rivaling Silicon Valley. It's not just about money, but also sovereignty. Just as roads, electricity, and water are essential utilities, today's digital infrastructure functions the same way, except that they're privately owned by US monopolies. If you want to communicate, work, or do business anywhere in the world, or even operate as a sovereign government, you're forced to rely on these monopolies for their services. Even official government agencies in foreign countries rely on Google, Microsoft, and Amazon Web Services, all US-based corporations with direct ties to American government. The United States actively weaponizes these platforms to advance its geopolitical interests. Billions of dollars are funneled into propaganda, regime change efforts, and surveillance, all facilitated through US-controlled social media and tech giants. The idea that these platforms are simply neutral tools is laughable. Facebook and Twitter have worked directly with US intelligence agencies to influence elections, shape political discourse, and suppress narratives that challenge American dominance. Without the firewall, China's economy, political stability, and digital sovereignty would be at the mercy of American corporations and the US government. Even if you still don't like China, you can still understand why it's an obvious choice for the government not to fuck themselves, right? Now that we've laid it all out, let's add it up. So overall, you have an internet that operates in the exact same capacity as the Western one, minus pornography, extreme violence, and gambling. There are a select few topics where information is not readily available. Profits are kept in the country. The internet is not beholden to a foreign country. The Western internet is easily accessible by VPN if still desired. Society is not rampant with misinformation and division. And the internet is still an effective tool and net benefit to society. Even if you still aren't convinced of its benefits on a personal level, you must admit, at the very least, it is a positive for the country's perspective. The financial aspect alone is a no-brainer. China is arguably the only country in the world that has complete digital sovereignty. What a tremendous advantage to keep. The US wouldn't allow a foreign government's internet to run their main information sphere, especially one that openly wants to overthrow it. That's common sense. Look at it in the same light for China's interests. Can you find a Chinese person that likes the Western style? Of course. There are Chinese people who really love the West and the values of hyper-individualism, and maybe don't share the collectivist culture of Chinese society. I have met some people in Shanghai who feel this way, but apart from the nuisance of downloading a VPN, there were no tangible things that they could mention about the Western internet apart from the cultural illusion of freedom it presents. In China, policies change all the time. The West doesn't change. What good is the freedom to say anything unbarred all the time if nothing ever changes and your society is incredibly divided as a result? Believe it or not, people living in a country experiencing a golden age where everything is getting better and who will objectively run the 21st century don't feel the need to overthrow their government. Apart from NGO members in the West paid to think this way, 99% of Chinese people are chill working within the current system through the methods I mentioned to fix the tangible issues in their life. They are perfectly content with the Chinese ecosystem. For those people who want access to the Western style, getting a VPN is really not that hard, and it's really not a big barrier to access. All of the pros I just mentioned far outweigh the cons for the baseline internet that Chinese people access. There are also considerations amongst the Chinese government to allow an unrestricted internet in the future once the obvious threats of competition and negative foreign influence have died down. I'm not saying that the Chinese system is meant for every country, but for China, at the current moment, Firewall is a great advantage. Please like and subscribe. Please watch my video on what China would be like without communism. And please let me know in the comments whether you agree or disagree. Peace.